Hello, everyone, and welcome back to those of you who are back. Welcome to those of you who are here joining us for the first time. It's always a nice thing during the week to see everyone from near and far. I'm Zach Lesser. I'm the faculty director of the seminar, and my co-organizers are Jerry Singerman, humanities editor at Penn Press, who also runs the material text book series that's loosely connected to the seminar. Jerry?
No, not so loosely, but welcome everybody.
And John Pollack, who's curator of research services at the Kislak Center and is on site in the Kislak Center again tonight.
Hi, friends.
And Philip Mogan, who is, of course, the Brisdell Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Texts.
Hi, everyone.
So as always, if you're not yet on our listserv but are just dropping in, you can get in touch with Philip and he'll add you, or there's a link on our website, pennmaterialtext.org, and you can join the listserv and you'll get the announcements each week. Also, feel free to send the email announcement with the link to friends and colleagues who might want to join us any given week. And we've got our spring 2021 schedule just about complete, and it looks great. We'll be posting the full schedule on our website and Twitter feed sometime in the near future as we lock down titles from everyone. And we've got great talks coming up for the rest of this semester as well, including next week when Jessa Lingle will talk about Craigslist. And I will say that Craig of Craigslist himself retweeted the announcement of this talk at the beginning of the semester, so you never know who may join us for material texts. Tonight, I am delighted to welcome Kenoi Nishikawa. He's Associate Professor of English and African American Studies at Princeton, but he is a proud Philadelphia resident. He earned his undergraduate degree from Dartmouth and his PhD from Duke. A leading scholar of African American literature and book history, his first book, Street Players, Black Pulp Fiction and the Making of a Literary Underground, came out from University of Chicago Press in 2018. And his talk tonight comes from his next book project, Black Paratext, which looks like it's going to be a major study of the influence of book design on post-45 African American literature. So Kenoi, welcome, and you can take over the screen when you're ready.
Thank you. I will do just that. Can you all see my title screen? Very good. First, I'd like to thank Zach, Jerry, and John for the invitation to present in this long-running workshop. Philip Mogan for the logistical support, and the material texts community, all of you, for including me in this conversation about how our work responds to and reckons with structural racism in our professional and everyday lives. I wrote about my new research project today with this imperative in mind, and I hope it adds to what's already been an illuminating dialogue. In 1968, editor and critic Hoyt Fuller published a manifesto that would give ideological shape to the Black arts movement already underway. Writing in the liberal Catholic arts and culture magazine, The Critic, Fuller builds on arguments by Amir Baraka, previously Leroy Jones and later Amiri Baraka, and James T. Stewart, that revolutionary Black artists needed to delve more deeply into their own cultural resources for inspiration and sustenance. Modeling their theory on the virtuosic jazz musicians of their day, Jones and Stewart conceive art as an extension of the Black man's being, a willful act of estrangement from those previous values of beauty and artistic order into which the artist has been socialized. Look in is the mantra of the moment. Find yourself, find the being, the speaker, is you, is the creator, is nothing. Fuller is equally committed to promoting revolutionary Black art, But his manifesto takes a more sociological view of the problem. Sidestepping the rhetoric of ontology, he seeks to open up institutional space for Black art, whatever new, if uncharted directions that may take. In particular, Fuller notes how Black writers have rejected the racist gatekeeping mechanisms of the literary establishment in a way that is cleaner and more decisive than the noisier and more dramatic break between the Black militants and traditional political and institutional structures. That's Fuller. Black writers have left behind the legitimating criteria of white publishers, editors, and critics to define what matters to their work and their readers on their own. They have begun the journey toward a Black aesthetic, writes Fuller, deploying the term for the first time and lending an infrastructural critique to an incipient cultural nationalism. But what exactly constitutes a Black aesthetic that can flourish outside of mainstream, presumptively white standards of legitimation? Though a notable body of criticism sought to answer precisely that question alongside and in the wake of Fuller's essay, the inherent variability of the Black arts movement resisted any consensus from forming. This is why it's necessary to recognize Black arts as coincident with, yet distinct from, Black power. Black arts influences can be traced not only to the two major strains of Black power, cultural nationalism and revolutionary Marxism, but to a host of artistic trends: modernism, postmodernism, avant-garde poetics, jazz and bebop, and experimental and street theater that had no necessary relation to either political ideology. Thus, despite the many efforts to define a Black aesthetic in its time, the movement did not cohere around a single idea of the form and function of art. Baraka's own trajectory attests to this, given that within the generally accepted span of the movement's periodization, he went from disgruntled beat poet to Black arts progenitor, to cultural nationalist convert, to national political player, and to revolutionary Marxist. There is no unitary Baraka, but Leroy Jones, Imamu Amir Baraka, and Amiri Baraka, a series of changes that are nonetheless radically the same. Rather than seek to define the formal qualities of a Black aesthetic, it seems more prudent to track its purposiveness in and as movement. To do so, we might reframe Fuller's essay to consider the material forms Black writing takes when it neither presumes nor has to abide the demands of a white readership. If Black art's guiding mission was to put Black readers first, regardless of taste or class, though acutely aware of access and social milieu, then a new account of the movement ought to proceed from the ground up, from the very design and production of books that, whatever their aesthetic qualities, looked and felt Black. Today, in my examination of the earliest Black arts press, Jihad Productions, we see how the idea of a Black book aesthetic was advanced as an open question of readerly engagement. In placing books on a continuum of cultural expression, and by appealing to readers in their immediate communities, Jihad bracketed the integrity of the edition to allow books to change wherever the movement took them. The assassination of Malcolm X on February 21st, 1965, spurred Black art's independent cultural production. Up to that point, Black radical newsletters and little magazines had begun to offer an alternative to mainstream civil rights discourse, focusing in particular on Pan-African politics. Here we might think of Liberation Committee for Africa's Liberator, militant activism, for example, Robert Williams' Crusader, and experimental literary aesthetics, such as Umbra Workshop's Umbra. Malcolm X's death was the tipping point that brought these threads together in a concerted way. Books were not the central concern of the movement at this stage. When Leroy Jones packed up his things and left downtown for uptown just days after the assassination, he was set on turning the brownstone at West 130th Street into a radical performance space, the Black Arts Repertory Theater School. In a way, the building was not the important thing about the project. From its first action, a parade across 125th Street with Sun Ra and his Myth-Science Orchestra leading, Albert Ayler and his brother Don blowing, and Milford Graves wailing his drums. And throughout the summer of 1965, Jones and his associates brought Black arts out of enclosed spaces and into the public. Paintings were given a wider viewership and outdoor exhibitions. Concerts were performed on the fly, often on trucks with stages designed from banquet tables held together by clamps. Plays were staged in the middle of thoroughfares, turning passers-by into audience members. And street corner poetry readings were now part of the scene in Harlem, not just Greenwich Village. A vibrant response to a tragedy felt across the community, Bart's summer was as fleeting as it was affirming. As Margot Natalie Crawford reminds us, Black art's creative energies were in many ways, quote, too excessive to be contained in books. Thus, the push for a Black book aesthetic required rethinking textuality as such, or what James Smethurst has described as the text and its relationship to the outside world, especially language and expressive culture beyond the printed page. After Bart's collapse under the weight of internal disagreement and lack of funding, Jones took to writing what would become the movement's clarion call. Black Art is a protest poem against the white literary establishment that doubles as a modernist critique of bourgeois aesthetics. It may have been composed out of a sense of loss, but it evokes in its very deconstruction of what a poem ought to do, the spirit of possibility. According to Joshua Cotten, a typescript of the poem is dated November 4th, 1965. Before it was printed in the January 1966 issue of Liberator, Jones recorded a live version of Black Art with free jazz drummer Sonny Murray on November 17th in Brooklyn. Shortly after Christmas, Jones returned to his hometown of Newark, New Jersey, seeking a fresh start. The new year saw him resurrect the idea of a Black performance space in his own home at 33 Sterling Street. He tore out the walls of the bottom floor and created a theater and de facto recording studio. One of the first things he did in that new space was to record a live version of his poem, Beautiful Black Woman, with an R&B group led by singer Freddie Johnson and bassist Yusuf Iman. Jones called his home Spirit House and envisioned it as a, quote, place to raise the soul, to raise the consciousness. In his account, it was to be another edition of the Black arts. This reconstruction of events sheds light on how Black arts books complemented other cultural activity and why flux during the movement's inception spurred creativity in print. Though conventionally dated to 1965 and 1968 respectively, the albums on which Jones's spoken word recordings appear likely came out in 1966 under a label he had just established in Newark, Jihad Productions. The evidence for this is the first impression of a chapbook that Jones wrote, designed, and printed himself, Black Art. The staple-bound 12-page book has front and back covers featuring a photograph by Danny Dawson of Black people lined up on a street or sidewalk with the children seated in front and the adults in the back. It may well be a document of Bart's parade the summer before. But on the opposite side of those two covers is an in-house advertisement announcing that this book, this edition of Black Art, is very much of Newark. There, for possibly the first time, we see the program for Jihad Productions, which will distribute and produce books, records, films, plays, and has a P.O. box in the city. 3 items are in stock: the LP Sonny's Time Now, the LP Black and Beautiful, and the first issue of Black People, a new magazine of Black poetry and art. Jihad was to be a holistic effort to render Black culture anew. The chapbook did not stand on its own. It was part and parcel of an audio, visual, and spiritual revitalization of Black people. But Black art itself represents a heretofore unrecognized turn in Jones's thinking and art. It bears reminding that the poem Black Art is meant to be overheard by white listeners. Indeed, its violence and anti-Semitism constitute the performative rupture with Jones's beat and bourgeois pass, the poetic correlative to the performative, to his controversial plays, Dutchman and The Slave. But Black art is not in Black art, which is significant. The chapbook might be said to offer a different vision for poetry, one not intent on breaking with whiteness, but focused on remaking Blackness. Beautiful Black Women is in there, as are the devotional A School of Prayer and a poem mourning his lost child and lover, The World is Full of Remarkable Things. To be sure, there is more than enough spleen in Poem, which shows Jones entertaining a homophobic critique of civil rights leader Roy Wilkins, who had denounced the rising Black Power movement in an October 17th letter to NAACP supporters. Yet, the vernacular register of Poem suggests a degree of familiarity with the reader that is not evident in his earlier work. If I ever see Roy Wilkins on the sidewalks, I'm gonna stick half my sandal up his ass. So taken together, these poems represent Jones's commitment to writing and publishing poetry for his community. The title page tells us that the selection is drawn from a forthcoming volume titled Black Art, part of a 3-volume work, Black Magic, Poems 1961 to 1966, set to be published in 1967. In advance of that anthologization, Jones wanted his poems to move among the denizens of Newark. The chapbook's design facilitated that reception and illuminates much about Jones's early days back home. Jihad's publishing was seeded when Jones and his new partner, Sylvia Wilson, began building a block association on Sterling Street. I had gotten a Mimeo machine down in the basement and an electric stencil maker, he recalls. The first thing he produced with these tools was a community newsletter, Sterling Street Newspaper, which covered city topics and was printed by kids in the neighborhood. We gave them a newspaper to run, to write, and print and distribute. We taught them to use business machines. We put them in plays. We got them politically in motion. These were the tools and community Jones drew on to create Black art. Mimeograph production takes his typescripts and reproduces them on sheets of differently colored paper. Though they have faded over the years, no one color seems to repeat. And the question of whether different copies are printed on in a different order of sheets is an open one. Bleed and smudge are evident throughout, but far from detracting from the production, these highlight its handmade production, which can also be gleaned from the colored-in stencils on the front and back covers. In this way, Black art recalled Jones and Diane DePrima's Mimeo newsletter, Floating Bear, which they edited and printed for 25 issues from 1961 to 1963. Yet it also departed from that serial publication in its status as an edition, a founding of Black arts, which was also a refounding of Black arts, whose audience was meant to be not an avant-garde coterie, but the ordinary people among whom the poet lived. Which brings us back to Sonny's Time Now and the second album, whose full title is Black and Beautiful, Soul and Madness. The confusion over their release dates stems from a lack of understanding how Jihad was built. Black art attests that it began as a local phenomenon in 1966 and moved outward to wider circles of readers and listeners over time. An uncredited mention in the March 1967 issue of the nationally circulating Negro Digest confirms that Jihad had just launched and made its way to Chicago, where the magazine was based. The note promotes only the 2 albums, and particularly Black and Beautiful, which it cites as a soul record promising an instant hit in the tune Miss Natural Soul. By foregrounding Jihad's take on the Motown sound, and by listing the P.O. box where readers could write to order their records, the note suggests a clue as to how Black arts could grow from a local hub into one node in a national movement. By 1967, Jihad would grow their list to several books by Jones's collaborators on the Newark scene. His own play Slave Ship and Arm Yourself or Harm Yourself, Ben Caldwell's play Militant Preacher, Yusuf Aman's play Praise the Lord but Pass the Ammunition, Clarence Reed's chapbook Not Forever Tears, the pamphlet Black Women's Role in Revolution, and Afro Arts Magazine, a collection of works from an outdoor festival Jones organized as the Black complement to Leopold Senghor's First World Festival of Negro Arts in Dakar, Senegal. All of these appeared for sale along with the records at the back of what was noted as the second printing of Black arts. Except this impression is not what it seems. A glance at the table of contents, which was new, shows an increase from 12 to 14 poems and a reordering of every poem except the first, the significance of which can be seen when placed alongside a makeshift table of contents for the 1966 version. And that makeshift version appears on the left side of your screen. Note as well the inclusion of a CF or centerfold section, which is introduced by Caldwell's illustration of a shirtless Black man using a white policeman's baton against him. The image of the sun beating down lends righteous cause to the image of the policeman's hair being pulled up in anticipation of the fatal blow. This illustration precedes Black Panther Emory Douglas's better-known graphic illustrations of the police as pigs by some years. These striking differences are encoded in the covers themselves. In passing, Jones later said this was the first publication to come out of jihad, describing it as a slim pamphlet of poetry with a cover photo showing young Larry Johnson being trained in karate in the Spirit House by Clarence Reed's son, Clarence. Jones could be forgiven the lapse. 1966 had moved out from under him. Though the title page still called this Black Art, the new cover announces it as Black Arts, a doubling or multiplying that is reflected in the images of Larry, Clarence, and a third figure training together in a photograph that wraps around the entire chapbook. There's a renewed militancy in Jones's art, an elaboration of the first printing's poem, here retitled Civil Rights Poem. Missing from the table of contents, Civil Rights Poem throws its support for Black Power behind the two new poems, Live, Stop Bullshitting, which refers to African-American US Senator Ed Brooke as Yankee Know-How, a kowtow to double Dutch anteaters, and Salik, a call to restore our gesture and understanding and the mad foolishness of crazy fucking America. As if to stave off the stasis of anthologization yet again, the copyright page changes the date of Black Magic's expected publication to 1968. Why would Jones call this the second printing and not another edition? Fredson Bowers is concise in sorting out these terms. In its purest sense, an edition of a book consists of all copies printed at any time or times from one setting of type. In other words, it's the sum of all impressions from one setting. According to this pure meaning, a new major edition is not created except by a complete resetting of the type. He goes on to make a crucial observation about the temporal dimension of these terms. All the copies of any single edition are not necessarily printed at any one time, but may accumulate from a series of separate impressions removed from each other in date. In other words, there's an inherent movement when we track printings within an edition, again, so long as the type is not reset. The thing is, the typescript that forms the basis of 1967's Black Art is different from that which was mimeoed the previous year. Besides the notable additions, Civil Rights at the beginning of poem, two new poems, and Caldwell's illustration, there are several changes, corrections, and fresh errors that emerge in the text. For example, A School of Prayer is mistakenly titled A School Prayer, while its line spacing is entirely new, creating different valences to the breaks. One stanza from 20th Century Fox is cut entirely, while the spacing and breaks of From the Egyptian are significantly altered in laying it out from a single page to 2 pages. There are also instances where a missed letter is retyped over and over again, as if trying to will away the error without having to retype the whole thing. You can see an example of this in the word accept in this second version of A School of Prayer. In traditional bibliographic description, the 1967 Black Art is not a second printing, but a new edition. Yet Jones's insistence on calling it that asks us to ponder exactly what inheres in his relation to the typescript. He offers a clue as to how he approached his jihad output in his 1970 essay, Technology and Ethos. A typewriter? Why should it only make use of the tips of the fingers as contact points of flowing multi-directional creativity? If I invented a word placing machine, an expression scriber, if you will, then I would have a kind of instrument into which I could step and sit or sprawl or hang and use not only fingers to make words express feelings, but elbows, feet, head, behind, and all the sounds I wanted, screams, grunts, taps, itches, I'd have magnetically recorded at the same time and translated into word. Or perhaps even the final express thought feeling would not be merely word or sheet, but itself the expression, three-dimensional, to be touched or tasted or felt or entered or hear or carried like a speaking, singing, constantly communicating charm. A typewriter is corny. That was Leroy Jones, by the way. This remarkable inhabitation of type, this fusion of body with technology in the form of an expression scriber, helps us understand how the 1967 Black Arts is not a rupture, but a continuation of his Newark project, the Spirit House edition of Black Arts. It may even rhyme with Bauer's admission that an edition does not actually exist as a material thing uniform within itself, but only as a term defining the relation between a series of impressions. To be sure, variance in this edition follows the history of the type or its equivalent up to the time it is melted down or destroyed. That's Bauer's. But what if, following Jones, type could resist such destruction? Jones's expression scriber is a living, breathing thing, one whose output exists in a kind of continuous present. The question of how Black Arts moves through word and sheet is raised yet again in what is noted as the third printing of Black Art in 1969. By this point, Jones had committed to Maulana Karenga's cultural nationalist philosophy of Qaeda, and to mark his reorientation, had taken on the name Imamu Amir Baraka and later Amir Baraka. Spirit House had expanded its reach in Newark, but Baraka's radicalization also meant that, as a figurehead of the insurgent masses, he clashed frequently with police and other authorities, especially after the riots that consumed the city in the summer of 1967. Finally, Jihad had released a third album, a 1968 recording of Baraka's Malcolm X inspired play, A Black Mass, with Sun Ra's Myth Science Orchestra, as well as selected reprints of books. The cover art of a 1969 printing of Slave Ship, possibly illustrated by Caldwell, shows the obverse of Black Art's tableau. Yet in some ways, both underscore the African connection between enslavement and resistance, with the play collapsing captain, sailor, and plantation owner into a single eternal oppressor figure. Like this impression of Slave Ship, the 1969 Black Art is printed on coated stock for the covers and higher quality paper for the text. This would have been in keeping with Baraka's growing celebrity. Okay. This would have been in keeping with Baraka's growing celebrity as a Black Arts and Black Power activist, itself indexed by the fact that a photograph portrait of him appears on the front cover. With Baraka's face becoming indelibly linked to both movements, it made sense for Jihad to use his likeness to reach a wider circle of readers. Now, at first glance, the work seems to fit the bill of another printing. Besides the covers and title page, most everything about the book looks like the 1967 version. Upon closer inspection, however, one can detect that the type has been reset, this time from typewritten to printed pages. Indeed, the quality of the printing suggests that we have left the mimeo behind for a professional job. Predictably, changes, corrections, and fresh errors emerge in the text. For example, the 6th line in 20th Century Fox is cleaned up so that pull-down hat is now fully legible, while missing or missed letters from the 1967 version are restored in a clean copy. But one poem strays even further from its 1966 version, when trespass into spirit now appears as trespass into spirit after resetting the collapse P and A without allowing space for 2 letters in the 1967 version. Even more, the raised pound sign that used to signify an annotation that appears at the bottom of the page has been erased entirely. Equally consequential is a case of the printer replacing "I'm gonna" for "I'm gonna" in civil rights poem, diminishing the oral impact of Jones's vernacular boast. If this is another edition of Black Art, what kind of meaning might issue from Baraka calling it a third printing? A hint appears on the front cover, the author's name as split from the portrait we see. In 1969, Bobbs Merrill brought out the final work he published as Leroy Jones in Black Magic Poetry 1961 to 1967. But by then he had been going by different names in the Black community, successive versions of Amiri Baraka. That the 1969 version of Black Art retains Leroy Jones is thus significant. It's as though Baraka is marking time and spiritual growth toward a Black book aesthetic by thinking of this particular chapbook as a continuously changing edition. It's the first work he published in the wake of Bart's dissolution. And in some sense, it was a foundation, no less important than Spirit House, for his building Black arts in Newark, not New York. To the extent that the book moved by design, it would register the evolution of Leroy Jones into the kufi-wearing artist activist we see on this cover. This is what Crawford means in describing Black art's literary production as the process of packaging the unpackageable. If that effort is bound to confound textual critics, like many of us here assembled, it might also open up our attention to histories of reading and reception that have escaped there, which is our attention. Recall the 1967 version of Black Art. Unlike the 1966 printing, whose dimensions are that of a letter-size page, this one is half letter size. That alteration accounts for some of the respacing, but it also explains why the verso of every page, except for the centerfold section, prints the poem on its side. Simply put, there's not enough space to type out and mimeo these poems vertically. Yet that limitation affords a different kind of reading experience. One is constantly having to flip the book around to read poems in succession. Ironically, everything but the centerfold has to be turned on its side from one page to the next. This is a movement determined by available resources, but it's a movement nonetheless, an archiving of gesture and motion that makes reading Black art look and feel like a martial art. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that really interesting talk. There's a lot in there that I'm sure our audience will have questions for. If you do have a question, just a reminder to use that raise hand function at the bottom of the participants pane. If you don't, some versions of Zoom seem not to have it. So if you don't, just wave or put your question in the chat. You can also write questions in the chat if you would rather pose them that way for one reason or another. So the floor is open. While we're waiting for people to formulate their questions, Kenoi, I wanted to ask you on that last point. So if the verso pages are kind of, it sounds like you're saying that they're reserved for poems with line lengths that wouldn't fit in the shorter dimensions. so that's, I wonder, that suggests that the order of the poems is being also determined by that, right? And so, which would be somewhat random, I assume, whether or not a given poem happened to have a particularly long line length. And so does that have something then to do with the reordering of poems? I couldn't keep track in my head the sequence of, of how these mapped onto each other. But then does that suggest that as technological capability changed in the edition that appears to be actually printed professionally, that the poems were rearranged perhaps to an order more in keeping with Baraka's preference, given more free reign, or, so that someone like Bowers, were he editing the book, would probably go with that ordering in a kind of authorially intended sequence. But it sounds like you were suggesting that there may have been other intentions at work in making the reader flip, sideways and back and forth in the earlier printings. And that last slide you showed, I couldn't actually it's hard to tell on the screen, but it didn't necessarily look like the line length on the flipped poem was much longer than at least one of the lines on the recto. So is that definitely, could there be other reasons for setting it that way? Or do all the versos have, the first verso you showed had very long lines, so I could see that.
Those are great questions, and actually points for further inquiry. I will say that there is one poem, namely SOS, that has short enough lines that does not merit being published on the verso according to line length. For those of you who are familiar with Baraka's poem, you might know SOS as the poem that begins calling all Black people. It's this kind of emergency signal to come together and build a new movement. That poem, which appears on the verso, has short enough lines, and so it doesn't necessarily merit being published so as to fit those lines. And that leads me to think, or to pursue this question of, besides line length, and not, sort of saying, well, it was a contingency based on the technology, what new meanings come out of this reordering, particularly considering the inclusion of that centerfold with that striking illustration by Ben Caldwell in the center? Because where SOS appears, which is these in the second printing, where SOS appears is right after civil rights poem, i.e. the sellout leadership who are not, down with Black power. SOS then appears on the verso of that, and 2 pages later we have Ben Caldwell's illustration. So in addition to movement and gesture, and recognizing that this was a technological constraint, I think there's something in Jones's reordering that is meaningful in its own right. There's a reason why SOS appears there on the verso, and I'd like to explore that a little bit more. So thank you.
Okay, we've got a few hands up. Jyotsna.
That was wonderful. That was such an illuminating talk. I often teach Amiri Baraka in my sort of gen ed courses with lots of other things. I have a larger sort of historical question about the sort of the cultural production and the Black aesthetic. And you use the word bourgeois several times, and that they were setting themselves apart. And I wonder if you have a sort of big picture of their legacy. I teach actually Colston Whitehead's Underground Railroad, which I love. So I'm just trying to see some genealogies here next time I'm teaching this stuff. I would be interested to know what you think.
Thank you for saying that, Jyotsna. That's very kind. With regard to bourgeois art, I will say that for many in the Black arts generation, their resistance to bourgeois art was very personal. Sonia Sanchez, Amiri Baraka, Larry Neal all came from solidly middle-class African-American families. And part of the revolt of the late 1960s was essentially, as we saw with the Roy Wilkins poem, breaking with what was then a kind of dominant civil rights discourse and generational discourse about integration and inclusion. When I said that I wrote up my research with this summer in mind for today's discussion, I meant that in that there were a number of directions I could have taken this talk, and the fuller chapter will indeed take it in multiple directions. But there's a way in which my reconstruction of essentially the beginnings of the Black arts press movement in 1966, and this is actually quite new. I acknowledge that little magazines and newsletters came out before then, but if we're talking about the press movement, this periodization is going to matter that I presented to you today. It represented a fundamental break with not just the beats and not just white modernism, but with middle-class Blackness. Now, what that looked like, I don't want to predetermine. Whitehead is an interesting example, in part because I would probably see, if we look at Whitehead's trajectory, there's some ways in which Whitehead's work does not speak to our present moment. And even though, especially some of his earlier work like Sag Harbor speaks to the Black middle class experience, it's one that perhaps the Black arts movement wouldn't find as rhyming with a militancy that they came to advocate. So the class dimensions of this are very important. And in this larger chapter, I'm going to be teasing that out through the way they design their books, essentially. And in the chapter that I am going to write after this, I'm going to look at, I don't call them necessarily Black arts practitioners, but the novelists who remained with mainstream publishers in the late 60s and early 70s, who Black arts had a very uneasy relationship with, and in some cases, especially with the figure known as William Melvin Kelly, considered sellouts. So the novelists who stayed with the likes of Doubleday do not fare well in the late 60s and early 70s. So you almost see that class split in the late 60s between poetry, performance, and independently published books on the one hand, and novelists who stay with New York's mainstream publishers on the other. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was very
good. JC, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for this great talk. It goes into so many amazing directions. It's very exciting work. As you were talking, and the point you just made about that importance of 1966 and the rise of smaller press magazines, also in the talk, I kept thinking about kind of you're both tracing the rise of this movement and kind of taking their own means of production, but also because of the focus on Baraka, kind of the rise of this, the evolution of this kind of changeling figure that he is. And thinking back to that very important moment of the assassination of Malcolm X, and Baraka himself is often talked about as being so formative for that move uptown and all of that, and the break from his past. There's one book, The Dead Lecturer, published in 1964, where I find that he's already doing so many of these interesting things with typesetting, and like there's one poem I love called The Invention of Comics in there, where he leaves empty square holes on the page like they're absent panels of comics. And that's how I often read those absences, these kinds of empty squares. But So just to say that he's already experimenting with how the poem will look on the page in that Leroy Jones 1964 moment, it was published by Grove Press, right? So it's interesting how you can trace the evolution, or how does it match, or how does the evolution of one single poet and intellectual and radical in his own kind of evolution versus the rise of this movement, and whether or not there's these antecedents, or can we see it as like a single career, like evolving in his own unique way, or is this really something that, as you say, kind of this rise in experimenting, does he kind of ramp up all of that typographic experimentation, the use of graphics and covers and all of that's endlessly fascinating to me. So I'm just curious to see if you've traced those evolutions in that way.
Thanks, JC. And needless to say, when I was trying to write about new work in Spirit House for this, I couldn't help but think of your and Brent Hayes Edwards' work actually, excavating some of the Spirit House stuff, which I have to say, Spirit House and Jihad Productions, for all their importance, remain two of the least understood sort of institutions, if you will, of the Black arts movement. So this definitely is a kind of tip of the hat to the work you've already done. You and Professor Edwards have already done. That is a great question about the dead lecturer. And what I will say, and I kind of wanted to acknowledge this through Floating Bear newsletter, which also has interesting typographic experimentation going on. I do see that Jones's dissatisfaction with a certain kind of avant-garde poetics leads him to the page, and basically the page becomes a place for him to experiment and think beyond even the beat movement. So that, I think, is, you can sort of do a longer sort of arc of this that extends before 1964. And I would also want to think critically about, because Jihad publishes so many plays, I'd also want to return to Dutchman and the Slave in their original publication states to see how it might have manifested there. Here's the difference, and this is building on my response to Jyotsna. Where I see Jones Baraka taking that play and that engagement with the page during the Black arts movement is in fact almost willfully and promiscuously multiplying the impressions under which any edition of a single work appears. In other words, there is a lack of fidelity to the edition as a bibliographic, much less publishing concept, that allows us to see how Jones in particular, but then Black arts in general, and this is the larger argument of my chapter, essentially creates multiple printings and impressions for a single edition that, in fact, if you look across them, are extremely different. And as you know, something like this generally wouldn't have been afforded by Grove, by Bobbs-Merrill, because they're operating in, more standard publishing procedures and practices. But the argument of my chapter is the difference of Black arts, and the difference it makes is that you see single editions that willfully and promiscuously multiply the printings such that we have only begun the work of compiling a bibliography of this movement, because printings don't match up to editions. It's not exactly clear when certain printings come out. And by the way, part of the confusion over when these records came out is that they didn't have copyright dates on them. So someone might have said 65 and 68 way back when, and it's just been repeated. But jihad did not start till 66. He was still in New York up until the very end of December. So this is the kind of bibliographic, but also theoretical work you and I and others in this room have to do in order to trace a movement that, let me just put it out there, printed in such a way that confounds any sort of bibliographic solidity or convention. So thank you, JC.
Eleanor Shevlin had a question.
Yes, and I'm far afield in here, so I was hesitating whether even to ask. But I'm thinking of the dating too, when you're talking about 66, and any influence or role that Hetty Jones may have played, because I felt, I'm back in Britain in the 18th century most times, so, but I understood that she was running the mimeograph and running the production and the editing while he was doing the textual production. So I'm wondering if there's a break. Do you see? It's around the time, I couldn't help when you were talking about lack of fidelity and promiscuous. It was just so you were going on about that. And I'm just thinking, oh, that's when, you know, he and Hetty. And so I'm just wondering if there was anything, the sensibility, because of course she was breaking with tradition, but of course she was also an anchor to traditions in that world. So I just wondered about any comments on that.
Well, Eleanor, this builds on JC's comment. Hetty Jones was essential to running with Leroy Jones, Eugen, the literary magazine Eugen, and then the press Totem, which published Jones's first chapbook, the Suicide Note collection. By 1966, and crucially, with the move to Newark, Hetty Jones is no longer part of Jones's life. And it is Sylvia Wilson who becomes Amina Baraka, who is the key to helping him run that mimeograph machine. So women's work is still a vital component of this story, and it's a story I'm still researching and telling. But it is in fact Amina Baraka, who was then known as Sylvia Wilson, who is the key to helping run that mimeograph. But thank you. It brings out Amina more, your question.
That's what I was asking, sorry, really just kind of a reaction almost to that work before. Like I was aware of the split. So it was what kind of reaction to the production that they were doing, and what kind of involvement was he having with the play on the page, the page and the play then, because I knew that his play came afterwards. That's just what, but I had never thought about the earlier period. So, but thank you.
Okay, Priya, go ahead.
So this was really wonderful, Kinohi, and material text, and very timely. And I'm hoping, Kinohi, you could just, so this is not necessarily a field of mine, but it's a field, it asks questions that I think are familiar to many of us, whether we come at it from post-colonial poetics and sort of legacies, and then when we think about sort of post-45 publishing. So I was just wondering if you could, so leaving the kind of minutiae that JC and Eleanor brought up and sort of looking at the big picture, a part of your project, the way it's coming through, is a project of excavation, or what we might call genealogy of Black arts. But there's embedded in it also sort of preoccupations, which I'm just wondering if you'd flesh out, which is the legacy of Black arts. And it seems that the wedge between the wedge or the gulf between genealogy and legacy lies in this concept of legibility. I mean, Baraka's funky typography makes one ask, right? What's Black about this? Is it the themes and topics he covers? Is it the insistence or the refusal with quote unquote mainstream materiality? I'm gonna make it mimeographed, I'm gonna make it cyclostyle, I'm gonna use this terrible font, et cetera, et cetera. Or is it his refusal to be part of, it's something you talked about at the very end, his refusal to be part of the mainstream. And you seem to suggest that that's where there's a split occurring. There are some writers who stay with the New York mainstream publishing apparatus and do very well. So one legacy of Black print culture and Black public culture is those writers. And the great unspoken here is Toni Morrison, right? So how would a figure like Baraka and his legacy, or the legacy of Black arts, align with or illuminate, right, the legacy of figures like Morrison, whose themes are quite similar, I think, but I may be wrong, but who has had such a long shadow, including in today's debates. Like when we think about what happened on May 29th, it's Morrison that comes to mind, not Baraka, not Sandra, etc. Is there a reason? Could you relate that back to some of this material work you're doing?
So this is really great. And typographic play is kind of an obsession of mine. But the more I write about the Black arts movement and its textual production, the more I'm leaning on what might be called silent or misleading multiplications of editions through impressions that change a lot of things within the text. The chapter that follows this is going to look at Ishmael Reed's Mumbo Jumbo, which maybe only some of you know, silently changes a number of the photographs that appear in it from hardcover edition to paperback without announcing it. And no one has actually ever written about this, which is why I'm going to write about it. You also see it, and Whitney, you discussed this over the weekend, but it's also something that I teach and that I have cited in my own pedagogy, which is Claudia Rankine's Citizen, which on facing pages late in the book, the first printing left open a space for names of what were then victims of police violence. I believe it started with Jordan Davis, and there were a handful of names, but silently and yet mournfully and respectfully, Rankine has added names to that verso over multiple printings without announcing a new edition. Now, you can imagine what it's like to teach this text, where students inevitably, based on the book trade and used book acquisition, find themselves with different copies of Citizen. And when I ask one of them to read out loud, everyone starts looking around saying, that's more than I have, or it doesn't stop there, which is Rankine's point. It also extends, Priya, to this summer's publication of Percival Everett's Telephone, which is a single novel that comes in 3 distinct and different printings. And unless you know to look for it, and I will be writing on this, so I'm not going to give away how to look for it, you don't know whether you're looking at one version over the other. So what I'm saying is that I've worked on typography in the past, and I'm continuing to work on that. But it's not like that's new, right? And I'm not even saying multiple impressions or printings are new, but the legacy of Black arts for me is somewhat, it's not about militant aesthetics per se, nor is it about even typographic play. I see it in the way Black novelists and poets have essentially wanted to fuck with the publishing apparatus. I mean, that's what it is if we want to channel Baraka. And they put out multiple printings in a single edition. Let me just say that. That's what it is. And again, I'm not saying this is new in the history of printing, but I'm saying it's a pretty interesting genealogy and legacy that one can track in post-45 publishing, where this is simply not afforded to many authors, this kind of play or freedom or experimentation. So that's where I'm going with the book and its argument about Black arts and its legacies.
That's very interesting. I just to follow up on that, when Baraka, has on the what's typically the copyright page, but I don't in the mimeograph book, it's not quite that. It says first edition, second printing, third printing. And I'm imagining he's not reading Bauer's Principles of Bibliographic Description, obviously, though it was available to him, so who knows. But is there, are you able to find evidence in texts surrounding Baraka or the Black Arts movement of what that term might have meant to him, second printing versus second edition, in letters or discussions? I don't know. Does it signify a kind? I mean, to me, just thinking off the top of my head, it might signify a kind of popularity, right? It had, second printing, third printing sort of suggests we sold out. New edition or revised edition kind of suggests the author's tinkering with it, but not necessarily that it's new printings are called for in that way. I don't know enough about 1960s publishing to know the particular connotations of that term, either in the industry broadly or as he might have encountered it in a more narrow world or circle than the New York publishing world. So I don't know, is there anything in the archive for you on that?
Nothing that I've been able to come up with since lockdown, but trust that this will be on my radar when I'm able to go back to Howard when restrictions are lifted. But let me say this, Zach, it's precisely that desire to honor what, in this case, Baraka himself might have thought of the quote edition, or hopefully the quote printing, that led me to home in on his calling Spirit House a new edition of Black Arts. That's his language. That helped me understand the investment in the word edition, which I'm trying to bring here. The basic point of my periodization is that we have not really tarried with the trauma that came out of Bart's disillusion and why exactly Jones moved to Newark in the first place. That trauma demanded a renewal. People just sort of say, well, there was Bart's in 65 and then there was Jihad, and well, it was all seamless. He was broken. And you've got to understand that to understand Spirit House as a new manifestation of Black Arts, and indeed a new edition of it. That's what he calls it. And if we call it that, we can then understand the trajectory from 66 to 69 as being true to that quote unquote edition, right, of Black Arts, which is the Newark Black Arts, not the New York Black Arts, but the Newark Black Arts.
John.
It's a fascinating discussion. Thank you. I'm really learning a lot, and I don't know much here, but just to follow on this thread, I mean, you've certainly convinced us that he's really aware of that bibliographic language and doing something with it, and that's what's so fascinating. And I don't know, I like Zach's suggestion there about sort of popularity maybe but I think if I recall, also on that same page, there's a very explicit statement about no reproduction and copying, which is, formulaic, of course, but it just trying to think what was, of course, this sort of mimeograph moment, what was their attitude toward, hey, I'll have a copy of this, or I'll make you a copy. I mean, it seems little, the sort of homegrown, everyone can do it printing versus this is a book and, I'm protecting it with the legal language of whatever the force that has or doesn't have. So what was their attitude toward, amateur printing? I mean, it's I don't know what else to say. It's just there's something interesting in there, it seems like. Thanks. Great stuff. Really great stuff.
Thanks, John. And ironically, and this is just to say I want to follow up on this, it may precisely be popularity beyond Newark that, shall we say, compels Jones/Baraka to insert that copyright acknowledgement or that warning in 1969, because of course you don't see it in the 66 version. And I believe in the 67 version, right? So the second printing, as it were, he even mentions his literary agent, Sterling Ward. So there is something there
okay.
about the new black arts taking off, Jihad's black arts taking off, and Jones both wanting to disseminate that, but then also protecting his work and his art with these insertions. But it's precisely that they go hand in hand, right? It's precisely his growing popularity and, frankly, his celebrity and copyright and protecting his work.
And copyright is a kind of a bourgeois, you arguably, how radical is it if you're not letting everybody do it? Yeah.
Absolutely. He was not, which is one of the kind of interesting things about him is that he really does become a celebrity. And by 69, he's very interested in protecting his image. That's all I'll say about that.
Jerry, go ahead.
Yeah, a question about the materiality of the mimeograph stencils. How well were they taken care of? How many copies was he able to get out of an individual stencil? I'm thinking about the difference between an edition and a printing. And if you think of an edition as one edition being conceptually very different from the next edition, so that's a major shift, right? But within a single edition, if you're working from mimeograph stencils, you need to basically reset it from scratch each time. It needs to be retyped, and you saw in the case of the accept, I think it was there are typing mistakes that just creep in. So what am I asking? I guess I'm asking whether the fact that he may need to reproduce new stencils all of the time for stages that he's not thinking of as whole new editions, so they get called reprintings, even though they're obviously not reprintings because the stencils had to be regenerated from scratch, if you get what I'm asking. And I mean, were the stencils of the different printings maintained and filed and archived, or did they end up in the trash? I mean, do we have any sense of the archive of Jihad as a publishing house?
I began to build that for this talk. Our chronology of the press and Spirit House is completely confounded and incoherent. And so I began to rebuild it through this talk. And that includes just getting a better sense of the dates of when certain, independent of Black art, when other books came out from the press. Second thing, the 1966 Black art that I shared with you all today, as far as I know, is not widely collected. I think there's a copy at the University of Delaware because it was part of their exhibition on Baraka and Black arts. But you will not find PDFs or even JPEGs of what I shared with you tonight anywhere on the internet. So needless to say, I have not been able to compare the copy I have access to another copy at a different institution. But again, when restrictions lift, I'd be interested in looking at the Delaware copy. So this is an exceedingly rare book. And in addition to the stenciling, which I'd like to compare and contrast, Jerry, I'm fascinated by whoever colored it in, because that's the coloring in, I have to believe, is unique to every print, to every copy of the 66 version. And I just have to wonder, because he talks so lovingly about the kids he mentored with that machine, if he in fact had neighborhoods kids color in Leroy Jones' Black Art on those first printings. It's, you know, whether or not I'm able to prove that, it at least is a tantalizing thread to pursue if I can compare the copy that I have access to with anything else out there. But even finding one is going to be difficult. This 66 edition.
Okay.
That's very interesting. And you know, if he is having neighborhood kids hand color, I mean there's a long history of hand coloring as a kind of job for kids in the family, right? Including high-end scientific works. And I mean, that would be an interesting connection. I also think one of the things you're bringing out, both, I mean, technologically, but perhaps also politically, is that the kind of classical definitions of edition, impression, issue, right, just sit uneasily with the kind of short-run technologies that are developed in the middle of the 20th century and just are hard to, you can make them fit, but they don't fit very well. So if like a mimeograph stencil is going to wear out after a couple hundred copies at the most, I think, you know, and then you're retyping it, so you've got a new edition there technically according to Bowers, but it's not really what Bowers is thinking of when he's thinking about these things. And so the affordances of the technology itself of these new duplicating machines seem so powerful in that moment for both economic reasons, political reasons, right? And what Bowers and what kind of bibliography is doing with, you know, is thinking about just such a completely different regime of printing that, you know, I think there's something very interesting going on there with, especially the more you want to argue that Baraka Jones himself is playing with these terms. Again, I don't think he knows Bowers, but he can be kind of speaking back to that history without, even if he doesn't really know Bowers' work, right? And that kind of relates to a question that Whitney put in the chat. Do you want to ask it aloud, Whitney?
Yeah, I know we're probably at time, and it's mostly been covered in the last 3 comments and so on. But thank you, Kenoi, for a great talk. I'm just thinking about how the difference now between our ability to look back at an archive and see a totality of something that's happening over time, and the situatedness and local moments where you're deciding to use mimeograph and then you want to go this. So it's not necessarily like he had a roadmap, it sounds like. I mean, he's making decisions based on shifting audiences and desires for his own work in the same way that he's changing his name, right, according to different desires. So there's like a shape-shifting quality to this that I think can't absolutely be captured by edition or impression, like Zach is saying. And I think that's kind of the heart of what you were talking about. So just more of a comment, but it's interesting to me. I see a lot of this in the 17th century too with handmade books. So, and it tends to be that distinction between the bespoke versus the commodification of the work. So yeah, fascinating stuff.
Sam, Sam Summers had a interesting comment that I think, again, links up to some of what Whitney's just been saying, but takes us further.
I mean, Whitney, you really articulated kind of what I was trying to think through when you said like being able to see the totality of something by the end. And then I think that's just much more well put than what I was getting at, which is a little bit like thinking about the 18th and 19th century. Like one of the things that I was wondering is like, yeah, I really wonder if there's different impressions of these texts, but how much has been lost in ways that we can't quite recover to the same extent. But we do see these larger, in the case of Douglas and William Wells Brown, we see these larger sort of more macro scale borrowing, reprinting, etc. But it's not as juicy to find them because they're so much bigger and more obvious in that way.
but that helpfully points to a longer arc for the sorts of experimentation that Jones is doing. I think that's really useful to think about, because again, it's not like it was so fundamental a break with the work he did before, Floating Bear, Yugen, Totem Press. But I'm really trying to understand what made Jihad Productions unique. And for example, taking a look at Black art in view of the long history of David Walker's appeal just gives me, I just want to think about the sort of typographic play going on between these two figures. And in fact, I do write on Walker's appeal when I talk about Broadside Press, which incorporates the manicule in one of its broadsides. But at any rate, it's this longer history is something that can come back as a way of helping me understand. So look, Jones came out of this genealogy, but in '66, what resources did he draw on in order to create a different kind of printing project, which is what Jihad ultimately was? Thanks, Sam.
Is there one more question lurking out there that someone has on their mind that they want to ask? Now's your chance. If not, then we'll thank Kenoi again. The night is getting darker earlier, so but I think it's a good time to wrap it up. And this was a great talk that really connected up to a lot, told us something new, and also connected up to a lot of longstanding interests of this group, and to a lot of long histories. So thank you very much. And we will see you all, hopefully see you all next week, when we'll be hearing about Craigslist to shift to a different kind of, but still a sort of homemade production.